In this lesson, we're going to talk about different file types that you can use to save your images. And this might seem like a pretty basic concept, but you'd be surprised how many questions I get about saving your images and what's the proper way to save your photograph after you've finished it in Photoshop. There's many different file types and a lot of them can be confusing. So I'm going to break down the most common file types and what you want to use and when you want to use them. There was an interesting story. I was on a workshop once and someone had told me they saved all of their layered documents from Photoshop as TIFF files. And they were telling me that they don't have any space left on their computer. And I was thinking to myself, wow, all of your layered files were saved as TIFFs and not PSDs. That's crazy because a layered file, when it's saved as a TIFF, and as you'll find out, TIFFs are designed to be lossless compression, so it makes very huge file sizes. Whereas Photoshop is pretty smart and has made a PSD file that's specifically for saving things with layers in them. So we're going to discuss all of these file types in depth here so that you make the right decisions on your savings for your file type. So here are some common image file types that you're going to see, whether it's on the internet or if you're saving in Photoshop. There's the JPEG, the PNG, the TIFF, the PSD, and the DNG. Now, all of these have a different purpose and all of them serve a different purpose and all of them do different things. A JPEG creates small images. It's an 8-bit file only. It will not carry 16-bit data into it because it can only handle 8-bit data. Even if you have a 16-bit file and you save it, it's going to convert it down to 8 bits. And I'll talk about that when we jump into Photoshop. JPEGs cannot contain layers. It's a lossy compression, meaning that it's kind of like the difference between a print and a RAW file on your computer. So a RAW file on your computer has all kinds of data in it. It can do all kinds of different things. A print is just what it is. It has no data in it. Now, there is data in a JPEG, but what I mean by that analogy is that there's not much you can do with the JPEG once you're in JPEG. That's why we tell people to shoot in RAW. Now, notice how I don't have RAW as a file type listed here. Your camera RAW file, that is. That's because you can't save as your camera's RAW file. So if you are finished with your photograph in Photoshop and you want to save it down to maybe send out to a printer like MPEX like I use, or to a client to make either small res or high res files, or if you're saving for the web, the JPEG is the most universal file type out there. Every program on the planet can read a JPEG. So a JPEG, while it does have its limitations, also has many benefits because it can be seen anywhere. A PNG, on the other hand, is very similar to a JPEG. It's a small image, 8-bit data only. It cannot contain layers. It does have a lossy compression to it. It is a universal file type, but it's actually best for saving transparent backgrounds. Question I get a lot is, I've got a logo and it's got a white background on it. How do I get rid of that? Well, before you flatten down the logo that you created, make a transparent background so that there's no background there, and you can save that logo with a transparent background around it. So when you upload it to the web or if you put it on a t-shirt, you don't have a white box around it. We'll talk about PNGs when we get into Photoshop. TIFFs. TIFFs are large images. They can be 8 or 16-bit. They can even be 32-bit. If you're doing a 32-bit HDR process, you'll see a 32-bit TIFF. It's a lossless compression, meaning it holds a ton of data in it, but that's why it's a large file. It's best for saving large files I would consider that are flattened. That means they have no layers in them, because if they have layers in them, that TIFF file is going to be huge. Remember I said at the beginning of this, there was an individual that I met that saved all of their layered documents as TIFFs. Well, that could be the difference between a 500 megabyte PSD file and a 1200 megabyte TIFF file, or 1.2 gigabyte TIFF file. Really, they can get huge. So we have to be careful about the TIFF format. So why would you use this TIFF format over something like a JPEG? Sometimes a printer might want a TIFF format, or maybe you might want your image in a TIFF format. Maybe you flatten down all of your layers in Photoshop and you want a high resolution version of that with no layers. A TIFF is a great option for that because it holds a lot of data in it. You can always access that stuff later, and it can have layers in it if you want, but it's going to make huge files. A PSD file, these are large images, but they are less in file size than a TIFF when we have layers incorporated in them. They can be an 8-bit, 16-bit, it's whatever data is set for that PSD file in Photoshop. It's a lossless compression, meaning you don't lose any of that data. It's best for saving your large files that have layers in them because Photoshop knows that you're going to be working with layers, so it's great for saving things with layers because they're less heavy than a TIFF. This is an Adobe proprietary file, which means it's not very universal among all programs. Some programs will not allow you to open up a PSD file because they're only readable and openable by Photoshop or something from Adobe for that matter. Okay, so keep that in mind. A DNG is kind of like a RAW file. It can hold 8-bit or 16-bit data, or even 32-bit data. If you're working with the HDR process, it's best for saving RAW files in Adobe Camera Raw. So for instance, if you're making a panorama in Adobe Camera Raw from many of your camera's proprietary RAW files, what you'll notice is that Adobe Camera Raw is going to prompt you to save a DNG file. What it's basically doing is it's taking all of that raw data from your camera stuff, combining those images together into a panorama, and then creating another raw image so you have a ton of data there. It's not your camera's raw image, it is a DNG file, which is a universal alternative to your camera's RAW file. You'll see a lot of programs can open up a DNG file. So a DNG, you wouldn't necessarily save in Photoshop. A DNG is something that you would save in Adobe Camera Raw when you're doing things like the HDR process or the panorama process, or maybe you want to convert your RAW files over to DNG. They are a little bit smaller than what your camera's RAW file will be, and they're universally accepted over all platforms. So let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop and I'll talk about how you can save some of these things. So what you're going to see here is this lesson 9 image file. It's just a basic image file. And what I want to show you is the different ways that you can save this image down in Photoshop. What I said before about 8-bit and 16-bit data. If we go to image and we go to image mode, you're going to see that this is an RGB image, meaning it's the RGB color space, and it is a 16 bits per channel file. So a JPEG can only be 8 bits. So if we go up to File and we go to Save As and we just save this down as a JPEG, we're going to right click inside of here and make a new folder and call this Test Saves. Okay? And we're going to save this as the JPEG 1. When we save this as a JPEG, if I were to open this up from where I saved it to, when we open this up, it's going to be flattened. A JPEG will automatically flatten itself after it's saved. If we go to image and we go to mode, you'll see it's 8-bit. Even though this had 16 bits of data in it and it had layers in it, when we save as a JPEG, Photoshop is smart enough to already flatten the image down for you and convert it from 16-bit to 8-bit data for the JPEG. Now, if we go into this file here, and let's just grab this file, this PSD file, and we'll bring it over here and paste it into here just so we can show the differences. This JPEG is a 105 kilobyte image file. This PSD file is a 4.38 megabyte file. So remember we said before, JPEGs are smaller in nature. This PSD file that we have here that we actually are using for this demo is a Photoshop file with layers in it. So it's got 16 bits of data plus all of those layers, which makes it a 4.38 megabyte file versus a JPEG of the exact same thing that's flattened down, has no layers in it, and is 8-bit and only a couple colors in it. It's 105 kilobytes, a very small file. So those are the advantages of a JPEG, is that they do shrink down very small and they're very universal because they look very good. A JPEG looks great when it's just sandwiched down and handed over to whatever program it needs to go to. Now, editing that data, JPEGs aren't always the best. That's why I always recommend people shoot with their cameras and with raw data rather than JPEG data. So let's go into Photoshop again. We'll close down this JPEG. So the next thing we talked about was the PNG, right? Well, if I wanted to save this as a PNG file, I would just turn the visibility off on this background layer. And you'll see that we now have transparent data there. So if I go up to File and I go to Save As and I drop this down to a PNG file, we're going to save this in this Test Saves area. We're going to call this PNG1 and press Save. Now it's going to ask, do you want this to be a large file size with fastest saving or interlacing, or a medium file size? I always do the larger file size because it ends up looking better, and we'll press OK. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that background layer back on this PSD file. I'm going to go into that file folder of all the test things. What you'll see in the preview here, I'll make this a little bit bigger, is in this preview it has no background. This one's blue, this one's on white. Well, it's just on white because Windows here can't show me a transparent background. But if I double click on this and I open this in Photoshop, look at that. It's got a transparent background. If I were to press V for the move tool, I can move this onto any image that I want and I now have that PNG file with no layers in it and also with all the transparency data preserved. That's why PNGs are great for logos. They're great for websites when you want to put text on a website. Some websites, like the one I run on F64 Academy, it allows me to put a background on my website, and then I can put an image on top of that background. So if I put a background image up and I want to put text on top of that, I can type the text out, save it as a PNG, and put it on top of it, and get it come with like a layered type of document on the web. Another good application for this is if you have a logo and you want to put it on a business card. Well, you don't want that logo to have a white background when you're putting it on a blue business card. So that's why it's always good to save your logos with a transparent background. If you save your logo as a JPEG and all you have is a JPEG with none of that transparent data in there from, say, maybe a layered file, it's going to be very difficult to separate that background from your logo. So always be thinking ahead when you're creating a logo. Always create it on a background that can be removed or stripped from it so that you can create a PNG file that has transparent data so you can move that logo onto anything that you want. The next file size that we had was a TIFF. So if I go up here to image and go to mode, this is a 16-bit image. We're going to go to file and we're going to save as, and we're going to save this as a TIFF. So we'll just press TIFF, we'll go into saves, we'll call this TIFF1. Now, what you're going to see here is image compression. How do you want this to work? Do you want any compression? No, I don't want any compression. If you just leave this as interlaced, that's fine, and leave all of this the same, that's fine. We can zip it if we wanted to here, but we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to leave it just the way it is, and we're going to press OK. We're going to get a pop-up that says including layers will increase the file size. Right now, just go ahead and press OK. Now what I want you to do is I want you to do that layer, flatten image, go to File, go to Save As, and we're going to save this again as a TIFF. We're going to call it TIFF2 and save it. Press OK. So now we'll go into that folder that we have here and look at our TIFFs. This TIFF1 had layers in it, didn't it? And it's a 9.34 megabyte file. It's actually a carbon copy of exactly the same thing that we had in that PSD file, correct? If we go over to the PSD file, look at this. It's a 4.38 megabyte file. So this TIFF file that contains the same layers as this PSD file is double the size. That's why it's really not smart to save your TIFFs with layers in them. If we go over to this TIFF that doesn't have any layers in it, it's all been sandwiched and flattened down. Look at the file size. It's 4.33 megabytes, which is actually comparable to our PSD file that had layers in it. So the thing to take away from this is that a TIFF file with layers in it is going to be a significantly larger file than a TIFF with no layers in it, or even than a PSD that has layers in it. So if you're considering saving all of your PSD files as TIFFs with layers, just think you could be doubling, sometimes even tripling the size of that file depending on how many layers are in it, and saving that onto your computer. Can you imagine how much space that would take up? The next file type that we talked about was the PSD file. So we're going to open up our Photoshop here. And I'm just going to open up the other one that had the layers in it. Where's the one that has layers in it? This one is our TIFF. This one is our PNG. I'll just go ahead and close these down because I'm starting to confuse myself. And we're just going to open up this image file types, okay? So this has layers in it. If this was a document that I was working on, whether it's a composite or it's a raw file that I've then brought into Photoshop and I've added curves and all these different adjustment layers on top of it, all the stuff that I add on top of it will be layers. So let's just add a bunch of different ones. We'll put a gradient map, we'll put a curve, and we'll put something else on there like a color balance or something like that. I'm just adding multiple layers here. It doesn't really matter about the data that's in them. If I go up to File and I go to Save As, I can save this as a Photoshop PSD file. We're going to call this PSD1 so that we know the difference. Press Save. Press OK. So now when I close this down, I come into here, you'll see that we have a PSD1 here. Now this PSD1 is 4.39 megabytes. This PSD is 4.38 megabytes. What's happened there because of the fact that I put a gradient map on there and a bunch of other layers is it's added a little bit more to that image file size. But one of the reasons why I put a gradient map on there is a gradient map is going to be one of those things that's going to take the colors in our image and it's going to basically merge them into that gradient map or a gradient scale. So if I pop back into Photoshop and I take that gradient map off so that this has colors in it, and I add maybe a color lookup table and something like a channel mixer and something like a photo filter. I'll change this photo, get a really high density, or we'll do a low density photo filter. And we'll go File, Save As, and PSD2. Press OK. Now when we look at this PSD2 is 4.4 megabytes. It's got a little bit more layers in it. It's got more color in it. So it's going to be bigger than this one here. The more layers that you stack into here, the bigger that file is going to be. Now it gets exponentially bigger. So don't just think if I add 4 layers to a large file and all this thing is going on, it's only going to increase by 0.01 megabytes. It's actually incremental based on the file size that you have. So if you're working on a giant A7R3 RAW file or a Nikon D850 RAW file, and you start adding all of these layers to it, even if they're adjustment layers, you would think, oh, it's only going to work at 0.01 megabytes per layer. That's not the case. So you can't just think of a per layer basis and how it's going to translate. It's going to be based on the image size that you started with and how it needs to save down. But the main point of this is just to break down what happens with those different file types when we save them as a JPEG, a PNG, a PSD, and a TIFF. The other one I didn't necessarily talk too much about was the DNG because a lot of that happens in Adobe Camera Raw, but let's take a look at the JPEG. So another look at the JPEG. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this just like this, and we're going to go up to File, and we're going to go up to Export, and we're going to go to Save for Web. Now the Save for Web dialog here might show up like this. What this Save for Web dialog is doing is it's showing you a way that it can compress that file even more. So we talked about JPEG being a lossy compression, right? Well, what's happening here is that this is allowing you, especially if we do this thing right here where it says 4 up, it's allowing us to see just how big this file is going to be when we save it down in even lower quality. So here, this is our original file. If we were to save this as an original file, just like this, it's going to be a 2.16 megabyte file. If we were to save this at a quality of 60, and we select this, notice how everything changes over here as a quality of 60, it's going to be a 27.1 kilobyte file. But what this allows us to do is if we zoom in on it, if we just kind of come over here and press Control and zoom in, or Command and zoom in, it allows us to see what's happening to our image as we save it at lower compression rates. If we were to select this one with a quality of 30, it might not be the greatest when we zoom in on it, but saving it for web, it might be a pretty fast save for web, which would be a 15.02 kilobyte file. And if we went with one of the worst ones at a quality of 15, it'd be an 11.9 kilobyte file. I'd say what would probably be most successful for this would be this quality of 60. So where this can help you is that if you're saving your images for a client, let's say you want low res images to ship to them really fast so that when you send them an image, it's not a 4 megabyte file or a 10 megabyte file. I would go up to Image and I'd go up to File, Export, and then go to the Legacy, Save for Web, and then I could select how big I want that file to be when I send it over to them. Because when I'm sending it to a client via email, you don't know how much their inbox is going to be able to handle, so you want to send them very small images, right? This is one of the best ways to save for the web is to use that Legacy Save for Web. Now you can get into all of the different dimensions here. You could maybe change the file size here too. Right now this is saying it's a 1008 wide image. If I made this an 800 wide image, it's going to change things even more. Once I commit to that, all of our image sizes get smaller. You see that? We went from 27 something to now 20.1 essentially. So you can change many of the different things inside of this Save for Web here. You can add some of that copyright data that's in that raw file, some of that metadata, and you can control some of the conversion that's happening with RGB, sRGB. So that's something that you can experiment with when you're saving out for web. If we say done, or we say save for that matter, we can save this to our desktop or wherever that might be where we'd want it to go. We'll press save and we're done. Now, it doesn't exactly flatten everything right now. You see that? Because it's just saving it out somewhere else as something different. We're not losing any data from the PSD file that we have here because we're just saving it out as a JPEG to somewhere else. It's kind of like an export. You take that big file and you export it out as something else. So the skinny, JPEG for low-res stuff and web, PNGs for logos, PSDs for layered files, TIFFs for high resolution images that are flattened, and DNGs in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom for that matter, where you want to save your RAW files out as an Adobe proprietary DNG RAW file that can be universally looked at over many different programs. In the next lesson, we're going to do a nice little wrap-up conclusion to this entire basics course.